Hi, dear colleagues. It's a pleasure to be with you again this year, this time in my role as the chair of the Nominations and Succession Planning Committee, the role filled by the past chair of ICMCI. This year, I had the pleasure of chairing a task force on governance. And in this task force, we've been looking very closely at the way in which we operate. The task force has brought together some really good thinkers. You'll know Kim Karma from Finland, Christine Cox from Australia, Shin Liat from Singapore, and our chair, Robert, and our executive director, Rima, have both been at all of the task force meetings. And the work that we've been doing has been to really understand how best to operate going forward. How do we ensure that we continue our success moving into the future? Looking back in history, in the first 25 odd years of the work of ICMCI, it was done completely by volunteers. In the early days, a handful of institutes would come together once a year. They would decide what they could do collaboratively that made sense, and then they would go away. And on the side of the desk, they would work on whatever they'd agreed to work on, and then report back in the next year. After the breakthrough strategy work that we did hire a full-time executive director, and that very fundamentally changed the way that we did our work, because no longer are we kind of doing it specifically and only as volunteers. We are engaging an executive director to be in charge of the implementation of the decisions that have been made. The analogy that I like to use is that of a ship. If you think about a ship that is going somewhere, it's the owner of the ships that make a decision about where that ship is going to go. And then the captain of the ship decides how best to get there. They have the destination in mind, but they have to figure out the best way to navigate the seas to get there. That analogy works in thinking about nonprofit organizations, because in our case, the annual meeting of delegates and through the authority that they delegate to the board of directors, form the governance of our organization. So this is the owner, this is the decider of where we're going, what we're doing. The staff that are hired are like the captain of the ship. They decide how best to get there. So in looking at that work, the work of the annual meeting is relatively straightforward and is clear. The work of the board has been fairly clear, could use a little bit of polishing. But the work of the committees has been confusing, because up until the breakthrough strategy, committees did the policy recommendation work. Once the board approved something, then they would do the implementation. So they were both governance in terms of policy recommendation and management in terms of doing the work that was necessary. And this has created some confusion, because if we're holding our executive director accountable for implementing programs and committees aren't quite sure of their role, then that's a problem. And it has shown that there have been some inefficiencies coming up and some lack of understanding about who does what when, and we want to ensure that we avoid that. So I'm not going to repeat the report today. I can't anyway. It's 44 pages long, 59 recommendations. Sorry about that. But it is a very comprehensive look at how we should operate moving forward. So I just want to give you a couple of the highlights. The first one is thinking around single points of accountability. So who is accountable for what? So there is work to be done in terms of our terms of reference, in terms of any role descriptions for our officers and directors of the board, and the different committee roles that we have in place. From the perspective of the task force, we are recommending that there should be two standing committees enshrined in bylaws, because these are committees that the delegates would want to be sure are in place for the work going forward. One of these would be nominations and succession planning committee, but renamed as governance and nominations. So that would be one of the standing committees. It would report to the board, it would do its work with the board, but it would also provide reports directly to the annual meeting of delegates in terms of best governance practices, and in terms of succession planning and recommending a slate of delegates for election. The second is a finance and audit committee. Strangely enough, this is not in the bylaws at this point, so we are recommending that that should be enshrined in the bylaws, and that we would have a finance and audit committee, again reporting to the board. The board would oversee their work between meetings of the annual meeting, but of course, finance and audit committee prepares reports to the annual meeting. There are four other committees that we also believe should be standing committees, but would be struck under the authority of the board. One being membership, second one being quality assurance, which oversees the quality of our certification programs, professional standards, and marketing and advocacy. In terms of other standing bodies, we did also talk about hubs, and hubs are a very important communication device, but we were thinking that we can have more flexibility there as well. So the geographic arrangement of hubs is very important and stands us in good stead, but we are using the philosophy of agile hubs. Are there other ways in which institutes can come together to collaborate? And we do want to ensure that that is possible. So looking at the terms of reference of hubs, how they're formed, how they collaborate and with institutes, how the ICMCI Secretariat oversees their work and the board oversees their work are all important considerations. The other aspect of single point of accountability that we're looking at is to create more accountability and authority at the director level at the board, so that directors should be recruited for the main programmatic themes, the main strategic directions of ICMCI. So, for example, there should be someone at the board who is an expert in membership and would be the chair of the membership standing committee and would oversee the work of that committee. Similarly, if there are other directors working on something that is not a standing committee, they would either have the expertise to take the leadership on that. Well, they would certainly have the leadership to take the expertise on that. But if they didn't have the capacity, they could strike a task force or recommend the striking of a task force, which the board would put in place. Similarly, the executive director would be able to put in place working groups where she could bring together volunteers to do work to support the implementation efforts of ICMCI. So the philosophy that I told you about governance and management in terms of our bodies also applies to our volunteers. And we need to bear in mind that volunteers can sometimes be on a standing committee and therefore be a governance volunteer, or they might help with the implementation of something and sometimes be a management or an operations volunteer. But the important thing is that we have to clarify to whom that person is accountable for the work. If they are doing work that is the implementation, then they are brought together and operate under the instructions of the executive director. And keeping these two aspects separate is very, very important. The last point I wanted to raise with you on this is around implementation. There's a lot to digest here, and there's a lot to think about. I do believe that there's some very, very important discussions to take place, and that the decisions that we make going forward can fundamentally improve the way that we do our work. So I'm really excited about that. But on the other hand, we are not asking that delegates approve this report for implementation immediately after this upcoming annual meeting. Rather, I think of this as the red flag meeting. If there are some issues that you think really do where we need to go back to the drawing boards, you need to flag those with us, either by email in advance or set up a Zoom call or at the meeting, just to let us know what's happening. Some of the recommendations you will see are pretty straightforward. We're actually operating that way now, but it's not been enshrined in policy, so we can fix that up and start operating that way easily. Others will take more time, and for instance, the recommendation about changing the NSPC to a governance and succession planning committee, governance and nominations committee. Sorry, I'll get all these terms right. We're just starting out here. Is something that does require a bylaw change. So that can't happen until until next year in October 2023. So we the last chapter of this report does talk about implementation, and I do assure you that we're not going to rush into this and implement things willy-nilly. What we do need is to start the discussion, look at how we do change our operating systems for the future, and then move forward. So you all have my email. Do reach out to me, or reach out to me through Rima. I know that you have her email for sure. And if you have any questions that you'd like us to think about before the annual meeting, and I'm looking forward to the discussion on October 13th when we can get your feedback on this work that we have done. Thank you very much.